Hello, now we're going to talk about aggregate supply and aggregate demand. Before we can get too far along that path, we need to review some terms, and one of those is that word itself, aggregate. What does the word aggregate mean? What does the verb aggregate mean? It means to put together. So aggregate means all put together, or in total, or in sum. We're talking about aggregate supply and aggregate demand. So let's review the meanings of our market demand curve and our market supply curve. The market demand curve was the graphical representation of the various quantities of goods or services, of a good or service, that consumers would be willing or able to purchase. The various quantities of a good or service that the consumer would be willing or able to purchase. Supply for the market, single market, those are the various quantities of the good or service that the sellers would be willing or able to produce or sell at various prices. Then we have one other term to get out of our way before we get to really into aggregate supply and aggregate demand, and that term is price level. The price level is the prices, represents the prices of all goods and services in an economy, right? That's different from the price of a good or service. And don't worry, we're going to explore a fair amount of why that's different. So when we're working with aggregate supply and aggregate demand, there's a reason to do this. And the reason came along in about 1936, because what had been going on was the Great Depression. And when the Great Depression came along, the thinking about economics or macroeconomics was that if left alone, things would revert back to equilibrium. And here is why that might be. During a recession, or as it was the Depression, there's high unemployment. A lot of people are willing and able to work, but without a job. People aren't buying much stuff, and that's related to the high unemployment. People don't have jobs, or they're scared that they're going to lose their job, so they're not spending money the way they otherwise would. So people aren't buying much stuff, and people are without jobs. Well, when people aren't buying much stuff, if you're a seller of stuff, in order to try to get some sales, you are sort of incentivized to put things on sale. That is to lower your prices. And if you're unemployed and there are job offers for lower wages than you're used to, well, you're incentivized to take a job even at a lower wage than you're used to, because after all, some pay is better than no pay. And if you're looking around and seeing these falling prices at the same time, you recognize that it's bearable. I can work for less because I'm seeing lower prices around me. And so we should gravitate back to full employment where we don't have that lingering high unemployment. But in the 1930s, we did have lingering high unemployment in the US and actually around the world. So John Maynard Keynes wrote his book, The General Theory, in 1936, and began the discussion of this framework as a way to analyze why that might be so. That's what we're motivated by. That's what we're out to do ultimately. And we'll be able to look at things like the Great Depression and any old run-of-the-mill recession. We're going to start with aggregate demand, just like we started with demand when we did the market model. We're going to define the term, just like we did before. Aggregate demand is the various quantities of output or real GDP the collected buyers would be willing or able to purchase at various price levels. I know that sounds too familiar. You're like, oh, this is going to be great. This is the same thing I've done. Yeah, it's not that. It's not. It'll get more complex. Trust me. Don't worry. So now we need to do like we did before. When we covered demand, we defined it and then we drew it. So now we're onto the aggregate demand curve. The aggregate demand curve is the illustration of the relationship between the level of prices and the quantity of real GDP demanded. So here we go with our first drawing for aggregate supply and aggregate demand. Instead of having Q, we have real GDP. Instead of having the price, we have the price level. You're like, this is easy. Oh, okay. And aggregate demand, it's no surprise, is downward sloping like demand was. What is surprising is why that's downward sloping. You see, demand is downward sloping because, now let's make sure we are clear what that means. When the price rises, consumers are willing and able to buy less of a particular good. Let's say a laptop, because that's what's in front of me. So when laptop computers prices rise, people, all else held constant, will buy fewer laptop computers. Well, why is that? Maybe they buy desktop computers. Maybe they use their phones for some of the tasks that they would be doing with those laptop computers while the price is high. Maybe they just say, I'm sick of looking at screens. I bet that's a feeling a lot of us could sympathize with right now. So I'm not going to get anything. I'm just going to do without laptop computers or phones or desktop computers or tablets or pods or pads or anything else. You can do that for a single good. So when high prices of a single good are occurring, the quantity demanded falls. How do you do that with everything? How do you do without everything? How do you do, what's the substitute for everything? There isn't one, because it's everything. So the reason this is downward sloping can't be the same as it is for a single good in a single market. It just can't be. So it turns out there are three reasons why aggregate demand is downward sloping. The first one has a couple names, depends on the textbook you look at. I prefer the real balances effect as the name for the cause of this downward slope of this curve. Another term is the wealth effect, but I think of the wealth effect in a different place, in a slightly different way. I think it's a little better, and I think it's more commonly used in a slightly different way. But some textbooks have the wealth effect. And the wealth effect works like this. Hypothetically now, suppose the price of everything in the economy doubles. And by everything in the economy's price is doubling, that includes your wages. So your wages double, and the price of everything you buy or have bills for doubles. What should that do to the amount of goods and services you buy? It should leave them unchanged. If you're citing reasons why you would change how much you would buy, you might ask yourself why you don't do that right now. Because if what you make doubles and the costs of purchasing things also doubles, you're actually right back where you started in your buying power. Except for one thing. That's the money in your savings. Or maybe in your wallet, or maybe tucked under your bed, wherever you put your cash. Because it is a fixed amount. If the price of everything doubles, it only buys half as much. And that's why I like the term real balances effect. Because the real balances of wealth that you have, and that's why they use the term wealth, doesn't have the buying power it used to. So at the higher price level, you can purchase less, not because of your income being lower, it's effectively the same, but because of the wealth that you held, or that some people held, being lower, that would decrease the quantity of purchases in the economy of real goods and services because of the higher price level. So that's the number one reason of my list of three reasons why this is downward sloping. The number two reason is more complex. It's called the interest rate effect. If the price of everything doubles, and it's not due to some abundance of money, that is, if we can imagine the money supply being the same amount of dollars floating, but the price of everything doubling, that makes money more valuable. The value of money is proxied with interest rates. That represents the value of money. It's what you have to pay to get money, right? So it's like the value of money. Okay, well, if money is more scarce because of the higher prices, and it takes away from people's wealth to buy stuff, that's why I'm suggesting money is this, approaching it from the scarcity angle. That means it's more valuable. What's left after purchases is more valuable. The value of money is interest rates. Interest rates are likely rising. Well, if interest rates are rising, how does that make you feel about maybe buying and financing a car, or getting a hot tub bought and then having it installed? Appliances, they always have these short-term loans to sell them and stuff like that. So you're less likely to do those things. If you're less likely to do those things, that's less consumption of those things. So that's why the second thing, I feel like it's more of a coincidence kind of thing than an explanation thing, the interest rate effect. But it's one of the reasons why this curve is likely downward sloping. The third thing is actually kind of the easiest to understand. It's called the open economy or exchange rate effect. If the price level in the United States doubles and our wages are doubling with it, setting aside the other things we talked about, no big deal. The buying power of our income is the same. But what about a person from another country, like let's say England? Are their wages doubling just because ours are? No. So what does that mean about their ability to buy our goods and services? It's diminished, and they make make up part of our aggregate demand. So this is why it's called the open economy effect, is because at higher price level, it's harder for other people in other countries to buy our goods. So those are the three reasons this is downward sloping. It's a lot more complex to think about than just the market demand curve, isn't it? Now we're still following our same pattern of discussion that we did with supply and demand. We defined what demand was here with aggregate demand, then we drew it. This time we had to explain it a little bit more. Then the next step that we did when we talked about demand was to look at the determinants of demand, or the shifters of demand. That's our next step here as well. When I do lists, I like to list the number of things in the list. Same as before, I find it easier as a student to memorize lists by knowing how many are in them. Well, there are determinants of demand, of aggregate demand, excuse me. There are 4. And I know you're thinking, oh my gosh, more to memorize. It's late in the semester. I don't want to memorize more lists, man. Well, I have some good news for you. Pretty much, I might be wrong about this being, if I say all, but I would say the vast majority of the lists we have to memorize going forward are things you're already familiar with. It's a really good deal. You don't have a deal like this in your sociology classes. I know you don't. I know you don't, because I had them. The determinants of aggregate demand are C, I, G, and NX, and that should be very familiar at this time. So memorizing something, not so much, not if you've already done that. And what do these things stand for again? Consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports, which is equal to exports minus imports. And of course, I'm abbreviating. So these are determinants of aggregate demand. We've already talked about these things. Hopefully you burn these into your memory. So memorizing them is not too bad. And they're pretty straightforward. If consumption rises, perhaps people feel particularly optimistic about the future, or they just have animal spirits, as the term is, and they feel irrationally exuberant, as Alan Greenspan called a similar behavior in the late 90s. That would increase aggregate demand. If firms feel good about the future and are investing in property, plant, and equipment, that would increase aggregate demand. If firms feel pessimistic about the future, that would decrease aggregate demand. Taxes play a big role on both of these, because disposable income, Y sub D, income is represented by Y, D for disposable, is equal to income minus taxes. And our disposable income, we may do one of two things with. We can spend it, that's consumption, or we can save it. That's set it aside. Well, if you think back to our production possibilities curve and our trade-off between consumption goods and capital goods, when we give up consumption goods, we can raise capital goods. You know why? Because investment equals savings. The money that we don't spend in the economy is the money we have left over to invest as an economy. So when you put it into the bank, you thinking that that's just my savings. That's not investment. I'm not putting it in the stock market. But they lend that out to someone. And if they lend it out, remember, a purchase of a new home is a household investment. That's a big part of what banks do. So right there, your money can be lent out in the form of investment. The money that we can set aside, the money that we're putting in our retirement accounts, even if you have a government operated retirement account, like the State Teachers Pension Association, or what, I think that name right. That money is being put actually into the stock market, and the money that is being put into those kinds of markets, they're using that money to buy property, plant, and equipment. So the money that what we don't consume today of our income, if we decrease our consumption, we're thinking of it as just saving it. But what we're saving is being used in our economy for our investment. It has to be the money that we don't consume is what we use for our investment. Now, taxes, circling back to this, decreases disposable income. So that decreases this up here and decreases the opportunity for either of these things, and thus can decrease investment or consumption to raise taxes on income. Of course, there's another discussion around taxes. I haven't heard it in a couple of years on consumption. If you tax consumption outright, like we do in the States with sales taxes, of course that would deter consumption as well. That would encourage saving. Another fun little interactive thing is interest rates. You might think of interest rates as encouraging saving because you can get paid more to put your money in saving. True. But here's a wild one. Think about how interest rates impacts consumption. I'm looking at a $2,000 MacBook, which I won, as a matter of fact. I'm kind of proud of my MacBook. I probably would have never spent $2,000 on a MacBook on a computer. I always bought the $350 computers, used them for 2 years, and moved on to another. That's a fair chunk of change, at least in my book. If I spend $2,000 on a computer, could you say the computer cost me $2,000? Yes. Could you say the computer cost me $2,000 plus the interest I could have made on the $2,000 if I'd put it in a financial instrument? Yes. So the greater the interest rate, the more costly it is to consume because of opportunity costs. I bet that blows your mind. You probably never thought about that, did you? So those are a couple of things that are fun things to think about and how they affect consumption and investment. Another little thing to think about is household debt. When household debt gets very high, eventually consumption is likely to fall as households seek to pay down that debt. Of course, when household debt is rising, that may be due to consumption, but you can think of diminishing marginal returns. As household debt rises, it's very likely that consumption is going to start rising at a falling rate and then people are going to pay down that debt. So I think of it as being a little related to diminishing marginal returns to something. A curve is what I'm saying. Expectations, of course, play a role in both consumption and investment. I kind of mentioned it. If households and firms are feeling very optimistic about the future, for whatever reason, it's likely that, respectively, consumption or investment are increasing. If we feel pessimistic about the future, like, for example, if we're hearing of rising cases of coronavirus or rising hospitalizations of coronavirus, which probably matters more, well, that gives me kind of creepy feelings about the future economically. And how does that make me feel about spending my money today? That might encourage me to hold on to my money. That would decrease aggregate demand today on the fear of the future. And firms behave the same way. If firms want to go hire new people when there are a rising number of cases, set aside the concern for health. They might be hiring people that they're going to have to turn around and lay off in a month because there's no consumers because of the rising cases, and we might be closed down, or people might be scared to go shopping or buy stuff, right? Well, that means that those firms aren't going to be hiring, and I'm saying hiring people, that's labor, maybe I shouldn't say that. They aren't going to be putting in property, plant, and equipment that would require those people today for fear of not having a use for that property, plant, and equipment in the future, or the use that they otherwise might have had due to coronavirus. Maybe I shouldn't have said hiring people. I was getting to that, I think, because it's the unemployment effect that we often see. but they do have to hire people to operate property, plant, and equipment. Property, plant, and equipment is investment, to be clear. So those are a few facets of those. And then these last two I haven't really touched on too much because they're pretty straightforward, I think. Government spending. When the government, federal government in particular, increases spending, that's an increase in aggregate demand. That's what stimulus bills are all about. It's increasing aggregate demand during bad times through government spending. Cuts in government spending should decrease aggregate demand. But there's an interesting facet here too. Where does the government get its money to raise aggregate demand? From taxes. But we already explored how high taxes or increases in taxes can decrease consumption or investment. So we have a balancing act. We face trade-offs, just like the 10 principles told us at the beginning of the semester. And of course, you might say, well, they can borrow it, but borrowing is just future taxes plus interest, and expectations play a role here too. There are no free rides. Net exports. When exports rise and imports are the same, that's an increase in aggregate demand. If exports stay the same and imports rise, that's a decrease in aggregate demand because of that minus symbol right there. So those are our determinants of aggregate demand. And that's everything I can say about aggregate demand until we start to include in our discussion things about aggregate supply and we start to put these things together. So I'm going to stop recording here and I'll pick up after this with aggregate.